All right, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order. And the purpose of this hearing is to examine the foreign assistance grant-making process at the State Department and related agencies. And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement as we begin. I want to recognize, number one, just that yesterday marked the 35th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre. The Chinese Communist Party may have held onto power, no doubt, as we can all see, but the spirit of the pro-democracy protesters evident in Tiananmen Square on June 3rd and June 4th of 1989, it does live on. Today's hearing is an opportunity for Congress to hold the State Department accountable for sending American tax dollars to thousands of foreign groups, hopefully in support of American values. But what we need to see as that's taking place is that there not be an instance where there's less accountability and oversight than is used to build a bridge or a road here at home. It's also an opportunity to examine what exactly are the State Department's priorities. Is it rising to the challenge of taking on foreign superpowers? Or is it promoting wokeness and social justice? When it comes to foreign assistance, the United States government provides more than every other nation combined. Every year, the State Department, DOD, the Commerce Department, Agriculture Department, the EPA, and many other federal agencies send tens of billions of dollars to other countries with very few strings attached and with basically no discernible strategic benefit for the United States of America and its citizens. At least that's the way many of my constituents feel as they take a look at this on a daily basis. The $500,000 grant promoting atheism in Nepal would be one example of this. Another example is that the Biden administration has sent more than $2.8 billion to Afghanistan since the Taliban took power in August of 2021. A report shows tens of millions of dollars of that money going directly into the hands of the Taliban. There was a grant for $20,000 to fund drag shows in Ecuador. Unfortunately, the examples mentioned are likely only the tip of the iceberg. As some of our witnesses will explain, there is a culture of rot within the State Department that has perverted how American tax dollars are being spent. We're seeing grants being structured to promote avowedly left-wing agendas. And then when the money is approved, there's little monitoring or evaluation of how these grants are implemented. Let's examine some of the examples that I gave. Take the $500,000 grant promoting atheism in Nepal, which was, to say the least, denied for hours in this very room until we actually held up the document, showing that this was in fact factual. This committee sent more than 10 requests for information about this grant to the State Department over a one-year period. We didn't get any answers until staff from this committee were able to track it down irrefutable proof when they were on a staff delegation to Nepal. The State Department was, in fact, funding atheism in Nepal. In many places, they're working to help build useless piers in places like Gaza. If that wasn't bad enough, the implementing partners are now admitting that that initial $500,000 was approved without the establishment clause concerns even being raised. The State Department doesn't want us to know how many of the instances like this have occurred, and it appears to me they don't know themselves. We need to know why the State Department is allowing grant beneficiaries to craft their own monitoring and evaluation criteria for how this money is spent. We need to know why the State Department is often unable to assess the actual impact of a grant. They can tell us that a grant went to an NGO tasked with distributing humanitarian aid in the form of wheat, yet they can't tell us if the wheat got into the hands of the civilians that actually need it. The State Department's preferred evaluation is an impact assessment, but they are not required and are seldom used. We need to know why that is the case. Finally, the hardworking American taxpayers who fund these grants, who go to work every day, have money taken out of their pocket and have it sent to other countries, they should be able to easily understand what is the benefit being derived for the United States of America with their dollars. And with certain humanitarian aid, the people in the State Department and or USAID, They don't even want to label this aid as coming from America. This makes you wonder even further, how do the people on the ground know that America has done something good for them? Every dollar spent abroad should benefit America's national security interests, period. Without waste, without excuse, and in a way wholly different from the transparency that we receive right now. America is competing for influence all across the globe with China and Russia and Iran and other enemies. We're fighting to secure allies, and our tax dollars should be going to benefit America's national security interests. Yet, we're not seeing that from Joe Biden's State Department. China's Belt and Road Initiative is building highways, ports, and bridges. Meanwhile, our State Department is promoting atheism. This is a failing strategy. And hopefully today's hearing and our witnesses will shed light on what Congress can do to ensure American tax dollars are not wasted. I look forward to hearing the testimony, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, for any opening statement that you may have.
Thank you, Chairman Mast. I want to start by thanking all of our witnesses for being here, and especially welcoming back our former colleague, Congressman Malinowski, to the committee to once again share his insights and his expertise. I hope that today we can have a good faith conversation about improvements to the foreign assistance process and about what robust assistance means for our interests in an era of renewed great power competition. This is what I believe this committee should be focused on and what congressional oversight should be all about. This hearing is also an opportunity to dispel some of the false arguments being pushed by those who want to curtail U.S. global engagement and leadership. These arguments have crept into the discourse in Washington and are amplifying talking points used by our adversaries to delegitimize the work of our diplomats and our development professionals around the world. So I want to set the record straight. Our foreign assistance is not a pot of handouts overseen by deep state bureaucrats pushing domestic political causes, nor is it a slush fund for writing blank checks to implementers without oversight. This is exactly what opponents of U.S. global leadership want the American people to believe, but it is not the truth. The truth is our foreign assistance programs go through rigorous process to justify their creation, competitive bidding to find the best implementers for the job, and have mechanisms in place to recoup American investment should any kind of waste, fraud, or abuse occur. The truth is these programs don't push domestic political agendas, but promote democracy and human rights, counter corruption, and expose the malign influence of Russia, China, Iran, and others. The truth is these programs help us strengthen existing relationships, build new partnerships, and create environments that are permissive for U.S. businesses. These efforts are vital to our national security. And that's not to say some parts of the process can't be improved, hence the need for this committee. Sometimes programs fall short in achieving their objectives, and sometimes mistakes are made. So I always welcome good faith suggestions from our witnesses about legitimate gaps that need filling and ways to make our programming more effective. But what I hope we avoid is using this hearing as a justification to gut our foreign assistance and our foreign policy. Since being elected to Congress, advancing the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States have been among my top priorities. And serving on the House Intelligence Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, one fact has repeatedly stood out as self-evident: that we cannot win the competition with Russia and China if we do not invest in the necessary tools to defeat them. That is why I'm deeply concerned about the Republicans' announced 11% cut to our state and foreign operations budget, and hope to discuss what draconian cuts like these would mean for our ability to use foreign assistance as a tool to advance our national interests. To quote former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." Thank you again to our witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. Mr. Richardson is the former director of the Office of Foreign Assistance at the State Department. Prior to this, he served as coordinator of U.S. Agency for International Development's Transportation Task Force team, where he established new policies and processes within the agency. The Honorable Robert Destro, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor during the Trump administration. As Assistant Secretary, he led the State Department's worldwide policy and foreign assistance programs on human rights and democracy issues such as free and fair elections, internet freedom, and the growth of the surveillance state. And lastly, we have the Honorable Tom Malinowski, formerly represented New Jersey's 7th Congressional District from 2019 to 2023. Prior to his time in Congress, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor during the Obama administration. Thank you for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for members' questions. And I now recognize Mr. Richardson for his opening statement.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of this committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss U.S. foreign assistance, specifically grants at the State Department. Foreign assistance does have the potential to be a force multiplier for U.S. interest while also positively impacting the lives of millions of people around the world. When done correctly, our foreign assistance demonstrates the best of America and enhances our security and economic goals. But foreign assistance is not charity, as both the chairman and ranking member have mentioned, and it should never be used to advance ideological or personal agendas. It should only be used to advance the core national security interests and goals of the United States. As someone who spent a lot of time here on the Hill at USAID and the State Department working on foreign assistance, I know that this committee has seen that our efforts don't always meet these expectations. We have seen grants undermine our closest allies, promote activities inconsistent with the culture or religion of partner nations, and fund projects that fail to advance America's core national security interest. But the world of grants at the State Department is complex. Unfortunately, we don't always have clear goals, clear approaches, or a clear model for success. Part of the challenge is honestly having too much money in the system. Part of it is an over-politicization of foreign assistance. And still another is that foreign assistance is just tough. It's hard to do in hard places. The first step of the process is to clearly articulate goals and objectives when approaching foreign assistance grants. As such, our grants should be aligned to the national security interest of the United States. Unfortunately, I do fear that the State Department has taken a far too decentralized approach, resulting in fairly murky goals and a lack of direction. Grants of the State Department are also too stovepiped, with often too little socialization across the enterprise. Functional bureaus don't always engage regional bureaus, embassies, or other agencies doing similar work, specifically USAID. This can often result in inherently less impactful programming, because I believe deeply that the best ideas have broad engagement and broad buy-in. The next step in the grant process is designing the notice for funding opportunities, which provides the roadmap for achieving objectives. During this process, we decide what type of grantee we want, what metrics will indicate success. Recently, and all too often, notices seem to be written to appeal to specific groups with specific ideological bents. This can generate outcomes incompatible with good diplomacy, as the values and ideas inherent in these grants can fundamentally be at odds with the local culture where they are intended to be implemented. This can alienate our partner countries, hamper development, and hinder U.S. strategic goals in the region. Furthermore, politicizing foreign assistance, which already does have low support among the American people, is just fundamentally unwise. I would argue that it's important for us to return to a much more traditional diplomatic and development approach that is focusing our attention on real national security priorities, albeit with new tools and paradigms with sharper monitoring and evaluation approaches. And this brings me to monitoring and evaluation and outcomes. Too often, our grants do not seem to meet common sense monitoring and evaluation standards. For example, grant awardees essentially write their own monitoring and evaluation requirements, including a focus on self-reporting quality versus quantitative data. This results in weak performance standards that rarely, if ever, include an impact assessment, as the chairman mentioned. And monitoring in the field is often non-existent. State Department officials rarely venture out from the capital city to see the progress of America's investments. Part of the challenge is the amount of funding in the system, and another part is the structural and cultural issues at the State Department. From the macro perspective, I fear the problem is even worse. Requirements are focused on inputs and outputs rather than outcomes. The State Department is pretty good at tracking inputs. Most bureaus can tell you whether the grant was used for the intended purpose. However, we fail to track whether the U.S. government is having the intended impact in the country or sector that we're trying to reach, or whether this type of program that we're actually funding is the most impactful approach. To that end, awardees should not write their own monitoring evaluation requirements. Instead, I would argue that a team of professionals in and out of the associated funding office and bureaus should draft them as part of the development and review process. Let me close with this. America is not alone on the foreign assistance stage. We are competing with nefarious and self-serving actors, including the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP knows exactly what it's trying to achieve with its foreign assistance-like efforts, from capturing strategic ports to controlling rare earth metals. There's no confusion or lack of focus on their part. Our foreign assistance efforts are inherently more noble than the CCP, but we owe it to the system. We owe a better system to the world and the American people. Again, I appreciate the committee's efforts to dig into this process. If we get it right, we'll not only direct our resources in a manner that advances America's national security, but also significantly improves our diplomatic efforts and achieve the best possible outcomes at home and abroad. Again, thanks so much for this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I now recognize Mr. Destra for his opening statement. Microphone, please.
Good. Thank you, sir.
That'll help us all.
Thank you. Chairman Mask, Ranking Member Crow, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for scheduling the hearing, and thank you for inviting us to be here. I'm going to do, in my kind of 5 minutes of remarks, something I learned at the State Department, which is to put the bottom line up front. And that is my specific recommendation today, because what you all do here is legislate, is that Congress require all federal agencies, not just the foreign assistance programs, to make detailed information about all unclassified grant awards and subawards, grantees and subgrantees, implementation and evaluation available online. Grants.gov, usaspending.gov, and foreignassistance.gov, as soon as the money is obligated. Otherwise, you run into the problems that Representative Crow talked about. You know, the idea of, well, what's the agenda here? I'm going to be considerably less charitable than my friend Jim Richardson, because when I got to the State Department, one of the first battles I fought, I mean, literally the first day I got there, was a member of my staff who wanted to go to another country in the Middle East and visit with all the grantees. And the answer was absolutely not. You know, and as the newly naive assistant secretary, I was like, well, I don't understand. To which the response was, well, you know, that's very sensitive information. You know, and my initial reaction was, well, don't I sign the checks? You know, and the answer was, well, you don't understand, that's very sensitive. To which the response was to hold up my badge and say, I have a higher security clearance than you do. And so what we're seeing here, if you take all that foreign assistance money and all the grants literally that go from the top down to the ground level, whether it's in Sudan or Belize or wherever, you know, we don't know the story of American foreign assistance programs unless we see what happens on the ground. That was the point that Jim was making. It's like, yeah, we spend a lot of money. You know, it took me a while to figure out that at DRL, we do a lot of training programs. We spend a ton of money on training. You know, the question is, what did they learn? And when I spoke with some folks from North Africa and asked them after having gone through the training whether or not they had, whether or not they knew what a whip list was, or they knew that they could go visit their representative down in their home district, they said, wow, we never learned that. To which I turned to the staff and said, well, what did they learn? So what we're seeing here, and I think that Representative Crow kind of accurately captures the problem when he says, and I don't think it's unreasonable, by writing blank checks to departments and administrative agencies across the federal government, Congress is funding and maintaining a vast counter-state. It's actively violating the constitutional laws of the United States by funding censorship programs designed to limit speech at home and abroad. It attacks religious freedom at home and abroad, and it spreads noxious theories about racial and cultural identity, both at home and abroad. Those programs, sometimes, not always, in fact, not most of the time, poison bilateral relations with other countries with incessant demands and funding for internal political change and cultural change, while failing to notice coup and growing opposition in friendly countries through its heavy-handed, and I would submit, unconstitutional use of sanctions tools against both friends, rivals, and American citizens. The counter-state that this Congress is funding and maintaining is comprised of unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats who no longer make any pretense of the fact that they are politically accountable when they actively resist efforts by Congress and the executive branch to oversee billions of dollars in federal grants for both foreign and domestic programs. Ideologically driven NGOs and international organizations who receive those billions through an opaque grants process that puts a premium on spending the money by the end of the fiscal year rather than by measuring outcomes in the places where they deliver services. And then lastly, a small and shrinking group of large NGOs and international development consulting firms who are the partners of choice for the bureaucracy because, unlike NGOs on the ground in country, they have the capacity to comply with the mind-numbing requirements of the federal acquisition regulations. And so I'm going to stop here and leave time for questions, but there's plenty of data I can add. I've got figures from Haiti, the Sahel, Afghanistan that will show you we got precious little for the money we spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Destro. Chair now recognizes Mr. Malinowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Crow. It's great to see you. Great to be back in this room. Chairman Mast, thank you for leading us off by reminding everybody that today is the 35th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's a day we always have to remember, but it also, I think, helps to ground this conversation in what's important, a reminder that we are still in a struggle between authoritarianism and dictatorship in the world, and we need to be giving the State Department the tools to stay in that fight. As you know, before I came to Congress, I was also the Assistant Secretary for the DRL, Bureau, Democracy and Human Rights. This is the State Department's frontline expeditionary force in supporting people who are struggling for freedom and democracy around the world. A couple things about the budget. It's grown quite a bit in the last few years, not because any president has demanded it, but because Congress has demanded it. And the main champions, in fact, of DRL's budget in Congress, I would say, have been Republican appropriators in the last few years. It's certainly been bipartisan. Another really important fact for you guys to keep in mind, DRL's grant programs around the world, 85% of them are earmarked by Congress for specific countries and purposes. This is not a blank check. This is a part of the State Department that is probably the most directed, the most overseen by Congress of any part of that department. I want to make sure everyone has a clear picture of what these funds do every single day. They support Chinese activists who have kept the spirit of that June 4th movement alive, helping them to break through the Chinese Communist Party's censorship and propaganda efforts and documenting their crimes. They help to smuggle news and books and TV shows and movies to North Korea so that the people of that closed communist dictatorship will know what life is like in democratic countries. They help Afghan women stay safe as they fight to get their rights back. When our military left, these grant programs remained. In Iran, they help dissidents safely access the global internet when the clerical regime tries to shut them off. They help Cubans document human rights abuses by their government and press for the release of political prisoners. They've empowered Christians and other religious minorities in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East fight for their rights under very difficult circumstances. Under a program I got started, they support anti-corruption investigators in every part of the world. And when we think about our contest with China and Russia, this is incredibly important. Every year, DRL grantees expose corrupt business deals that the Chinese government in particular is foisting on countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, very much in our interest. Putin and Xi hate these programs. They hate what we do with this money. That's why they are pushing all of their allies in the developing world to pass these copycat laws, criminalizing these kinds of partnerships with the United States and other Western aid agencies. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the country of Georgia on the streets the last few weeks protesting that kind of law. They know what's at stake, so does their Russian-supported government. And what disturbs me most is that our adversaries have now turned to influence operations in the United States to try to discredit what the State Department does. Now, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, you know I don't mince words or dance around sensitive subjects, so I'm going to align myself with the chairman of this full committee, Mr. McCall, my friend, who recently said that Russian propaganda has made its way into the congressional debate about America's support for our friends and allies in the world. I will align myself with Senator Mitch McConnell, who I often don't agree with, but who recently warned us not to take our foreign policy cues from Viktor Orban's Hungary, a country that he rightly said serves as China's doormat to Europe. I get why authoritarian governments and American think tanks that have forged partnerships with those governments might want us to stop these efforts. I get why they're smart enough to be using language from our own culture wars, language about wokeness, to try to turn us against what our government does to promote freedom and democracy around the world. I don't get why any of us would listen. Doesn't mean I agree with everything the State Department does. If you asked me to review the 1,000 or so grants that DRL manages every single year, I'm sure I'd find a couple things I disagree with or that I'd redirect. And obviously, I believe in strong congressional oversight. But the last thing we should do is to gut or politicize this programming or to disparage the hardworking, nonpartisan career public servants who implement it. That would be doing to ourselves what our adversaries have long tried and failed to do to us. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. And let me just say, I do love this panel, and this is not to diminish you at all, Mr. Richardson, but I love the fact that we have two individuals having held the same position at different times from different administrations. I think it does allow us to get a very good understanding of some of the work that's done there. So I'm glad to see the way that this panel was formulated. Members are going to be recognized for 5 minutes of questioning. And if they want, we'll probably go to another round of questioning if members desire. I'm going to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And Mr. Malinowski used the term earmarks. I also sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. When I think of an earmark, I might not do the design and engineering of a bridge, but we're going to directly identify, hey, we need a bridge here, a road here, a piece of track here, or whatever it is, and we're going to directly identify that. And I would dare say that if we did foreign assistance in that way, I think most members of Congress would probably not want to put their names on a lot of the grants that are going out, or as you used them, called them earmarks. I don't think they would want to earmark them with their name on it, but how do you mean that term earmarks? Because it's not the same way that we would talk about a transportation earmark.
It's not exactly the same, but basically the way it works is Congress will say, all right, State Department, you've got hundreds of millions of dollars. We are going to direct that you spend, say, I'm making this up, $4 million on internet freedom programs for the people of Iran. You're not picking the contractor who might implement that program if it's done that way, but you're also not picking the contractor who's going to build your bridge, right? You're saying this is the objective, this is what I want you to try to achieve in this place. And then the State Department goes out, hopefully, ideally, in consultation with those members of Congress who are most interested in that, and they figure out a way to do that. And then the oversight does not end, because if you are the person in Congress who pushed that earmark, you're, I assume, going to be talking to them regularly about how they're going about implementing.
So I wouldn't call that an earmark, right? It'd be like saying, well, Congress approved $100 million for roads across America. That doesn't mean we said which roads want to build. We just approved money for roads. That's not directly saying
No,
we
it's
need one
much more
here, we
specific.
need one there.
It's much more specific. So,
But the members are not putting their names on the specifics of the ones that they
no,
want.
you're passing it, it's in the law.
We
So-
need members to put their names on the specifics of these.
Right. Well, I think the difference is
I'm
when
going
I
to
would
move to
earmark
Mr. Destro,
something.
but I thank you for your analogy. I appreciate it. It gave me some food for thought.
It's
I'm
not for
thankful.
your district. That's the difference.
So Mr. Destro, I want to go to whether what I brought up with some of the examples, drag shows in Ecuador, approved, ultimately not funded because of all of the political pressure, but moronic to say the least. The atheism in Nepal, $500,000. The money going to the Taliban, you name it. Are these outliers, or is this the tip of the iceberg? Microphone, please.
I agree with Congressman Malinowski that the staff is hardworking, that they're dedicated public servants. But I can also tell you that the staff in DRL, the policy staff in DRL versus the funding staff in DRL, was extremely frustrating. I mean, they could not get information about where the money was going in their countries. And they were completely forbidden to talk to the contractors. And so, I mean, when you look at a country like Lebanon, who had an earthquake in the explosion in the port, you know, I called our staff together and said, well, what are we doing in Lebanon where we can kind of get the contractors and get people over there to help them? You know, you look at the perception of our programs. I have spoken to, since I left the State Department and during the time I was there, to many people in Nigeria. I've introduced them to grants.gov. I've introduced them to usaspending.gov. And the response is, this is like the dew that never makes it to the grass. Where is all that money going? How is it helping us? And so the perception here, I don't want to undercut the really good work that's done. The problem is that you have a State Department, among other things, that is paying to foster internet censorship, which is exactly the opposite of what we in DRL were supposed to be doing.
So let me ask again, are the examples I gave the tip of the iceberg, or are they outliers?
I think the answer is not clear. And I don't think if one of the things I mentioned in my written statement is that in response to staff concerns, I asked DRL to come up, the technical people at State, to come up with a real-time database of where we were spending our money.
All of it?
All of it. You know, all of it. So that all the other bureaus could get to it, it would tap into the
How did it work?
database. And it was built. And it was one of my most progressive and I think honorable staff members. I mean, I loved her opinions on things. Said, you know, that data is pretty inconvenient. It's going to cause an uproar in the countries if the information gets out. So those are not my words. And so the fact of the matter is, Mr. Mask, we don't know the answer to your question because the information is opaque and not available.
Thank you, Mr. Destro. Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Sorry I didn't get to a question to you, Mr. Richardson. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, it strikes me that there's two issues going on here. There's one discussion about whether or not we should be doing this stuff at all, right? Whether this money should be appropriated for these programs in the first instance. And that's kind of the larger debate that we're having right now as we address the Republicans' proposed 11% across the board cut for SFOPs, which would cut off a lot of these programs, versus, Mr. Destro, what I'm hearing you say about implementation and oversight of these programs, right? Which seems to be the thrust of this conversation, not necessarily that we shouldn't be doing these things, that they do have value if they're done the way they should be done, versus making sure they are done the right way. So, Mr. Malinowski, I would just love to hear your response to Mr. Destro's comments about implementation and oversight and your experience with that.
Yeah, I find it very strange. I signed off on every grant. I knew exactly what we were doing around the world. I don't think any of my predecessors, certainly I did not have any trouble understanding what we were doing. There was trust between leadership and staff. Talking about transparency and putting this stuff online, do not forget, particularly for the bureau that we both led, most of the grants are going to help people who are living in dictatorships. Mr. Destro mentioned Lebanon. Like, imagine you're giving a grant to an NGO in Lebanon that is fighting corruption in that country, where the government is heavily influenced by Hezbollah. You're telling me you're going to put that on a website so that Hezbollah can see exactly who in Lebanon is getting a grant to expose their corruption? Are you crazy? So if members of his staff were telling him this is sensitive, they were absolutely right. We are helping people who are risking their freedom and in some cases their lives to stand up for democracy, freedom, and human rights in their countries. And you're darn right. One of the main missions of the staff in that bureau and in others in the State Department is to keep our partners safe. The Assistant Secretary knows what's going on if he or she is running the bureau correctly, but that doesn't mean, and Congress should know if you ask, but we have to keep that in mind.
And Mr. Destro, do you think that an 11% across-the-board cut to the SFAPS program would be, in your view, beneficial? Would that enhance oversight or solve the problem that you're talking about implementation and transparency?
Well, you've got a couple of questions there. I don't think that an 11% cut is unreasonable. I mean, most Americans are taking a much bigger haircut when they go to the grocery store every day. And so the fact that it's not the amount of money that we spent, I think Jim Richardson and Tom Malinowski have both said, it's the effect and the outcome that we're looking for. And it's not fraud, waste, and abuse we're talking about. That's the wrong that's a category error. What we're talking about is programs that don't advance America's foreign policy interest, and many programs that actually antagonize the people in the country who get it.
And your response to that, Mr. Malinowski?
Well, they certainly don't antagonize the people who get it. What I've heard a couple of times from Mr. Destro is that they may antagonize governments. And I'm surprised to hear a former Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights suggest that we shouldn't be making democracy and human rights grants that antagonize governments. I mean, by definition, if you are helping people, and that's the mission of this Bureau and of the State Department, a mission defined by the U.S. Congress, if you're helping people advance human rights and democratic reform, dictators aren't going to like that.
I guess one thing is I'm struggling with this notion that the resources and the amount of money doesn't matter, it's the effect. But if you're cutting the resources and you're cutting what you're actually allocating in the projects themselves, then the effect goes away, right?
Of course it matters, and it matters at a time, and I think there's bipartisan recognition of this, as we've heard today, that China in particular, and Russia to some extent, spend billions of dollars on influence operations around the world. And our comparative advantage in these countries is that we, unlike them, are associated by the peoples of these countries with these values of rule of law, human rights, democracy, that we work with them, we work with civil society. And we should be doing more of that, not less of that, if we're going to actually win this competition, if we're going to be serious about it.
I think the point for me here is that you can't separate the conversation about allocation of resources and implementation, right? If you get rid of the resources, then implementation doesn't matter because the programs go away, right? And I'm all about increasing efficiency, having better implementation, doing things better all the time. Every organization can do things better. But if we cut the resources and the programs go away, then the entire conversation goes away, and we can't even have a seat at the table. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Tom, it's good to see you. Welcome back. Mr. Destro, you coordinated for Tibetan issues when you were working in the last administration. I think Tibet suffers, as we know, from deteriorating human rights, poor economic development conditions, restrictions against religious freedoms, and repression of Tibetan culture as the Party of China seeks to consume and subsume Tibet. With that in mind, did the Biden State Department encourage atheism in Tibet? Is that my understanding? And I just want to, do you know about, what's the story there?
It was in Nepal.
It was in Nepal.
In
Okay.
Nepal. And I can tell you.
Okay, okay, go ahead, tell me.
No, please finish your question.
Well, what's the interest of the United States of America in supporting atheism in Nepal? Like how does that help us? What are we trying to achieve?
Well, there's two answers to that question. One, we don't have any. And there's no evidence that atheists are a persecuted class in Nepal. But even more so, you know, one of the big issues I had to deal with is talking Nepal into not sending people back to China. Right? I had to intervene with the foreign minister and ask him, please don't send people back who escape. And you could expect, once this came out, where the conversation would be, so why are you trying to destroy our culture? You know, so you're asking other countries to do things in the field of human rights, very valuable things in human rights. And then you're kind of hitting them in places they don't expect to get hit. And it's a false dichotomy that Mr. Malinowski is pointing out. It's not just about governments. It's about how the people see our government spending and who they're spending it on. The people in Nigeria I have been speaking to for years now, and they say, who are these people who get the money? What do they do with it? And I have suggested that their independent journalists go out and start knocking on some of the doors to find out where that money comes from.
Yeah, I'm actually outraged that we're spending money, whether it's in Tibet or Nepal, on atheism abroad. I just feel like we could better spend our money, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Mr. Richardson, it's come to my attention that grant awardees were being able to write their own monitoring and evaluation requirements. So they get the grant money. That's my understanding, so I want you to confirm this. Maybe I'm wrong. And then they write their own monitoring and evaluation, so they're watching themselves and how they spend it. Is that, am I characterizing it?
That's essentially right. When a grantee puts forward its proposal, it'll have a monitoring evaluation section. In that, often what you find is that the monitoring evaluation standards seem, I would argue, pretty weak, and so, but it is almost a self-reporting. The latest guidance that I saw from the State Department focuses on essentially a qualitative, personal experience of whether that funding helped them or not. And rather than looking at actual data or doing a true analysis and true monitoring and evaluation, which is what you would actually want to do. Because what you really want to do is see, does that money actually have the impact you're trying to accomplish, rather than does this just make people feel good? And that seems to be the direction that the State Department seems to be taking in this new monitoring and evaluation standards that they've put forward.
So it seems to me that we should be, you know, when the people in the district I represent wake up early in the morning and head off to work to pay their taxes, can't afford their groceries, their electricity bill, you know, their daycare bill, funding things, climate pet projects, or, you know, DEI initiatives, other fabricated issues, as I would call them, as opposed to major infrastructure projects, oil and gas leasing or drilling, mining, real economic development projects that could be assessed at tangible results, and then evaluating whether these funds have an impact is essentially optional, is astounding to me, in the sense that last year, 2023, foreign assistance, government, state, and USAID combined spent $56 billion. For $56 billion, while China's out doing hard things, they're not doing DEI initiatives. I guarantee you, they are not. And climate issues. They're not doing any of that stuff. we're spending our taxpayers' money on this stuff, and then we're not even requiring a third-party evaluation on effectiveness. It's astounding. It's outrageous. For those who say 11% is too much, let me tell you what will tighten up the organization, not having as much to spread around because they're spreading it around willy-nilly like they don't care because they don't care. Well, my people, the people that I represent that are working hard for their money, they do care and they don't want it wasted. I yield the balance.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Votes have been called. Are we still good to go?
If you would be more comfortable coming back here after the vote, we can hold until then. I can give you your 5 minutes then. Either way.
Okay, there's still time. Progress. Mr. Malinowski, it's good seeing you, brother. I miss your receiving abilities on the football field.
I can still play on the football team, you know.
Yes,
if
you
you'll have
can.
me.
Well, but with all those pros, they don't ever throw to people like me and you anyway. So anyway,
I think you caught a couple when.
well, I'm incredibly gifted. Thank you for noticing. Mr. Richardson, I appreciate all y'all being here and all the usual stuff we say. Can you explain how too much money in foreign aid can be a bad thing?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. It is I would say two things. One, you always want to look at the outcomes rather than the inputs, which is the money going into the system. Not every program is designed for the same impact. Not every sector will have the same level of impact that is directed to the national security interest of the United States. When it comes to the pure dollars in, what you find is that we have both grant officers and contracting officers who are actually doing the hard work of crafting the right grant agreement or the right contracting agreement or the right cooperative agreement. And if you have too much money into the system, you're overburdening those contracting officials, and so that results in less quality and less focus. The other part of this is that from a foreign assistance perspective, you really want to cut out the German manager or the British NGO that is managing your resources. You want to put the money as close to the recipient as possible. It's called localization. That's really hard. You have to find local actors. So it takes longer and it's more labor intensive, and you probably can't put as much money into the system, but you ultimately will have a better impact at the end of the day. So having less money into the system allows you to better localize resources, better focus your attention on improving the actual approach that you're taking in order to have that better focus on impact.
Thank you for that answer. I would remind you that John sitting behind me, apparently you hired him.
I brought John to Washington, hired him in his first job. It's great to see you.
He's not much to look at, but he does a pretty good job.
He's a good Kansan.
I've had a couple of good ones in that position. One of them was over there, but he's left too. What needs to change culturally, I think, at the State Department? USAID, we hear a lot of talk about that and just cutting it out for foreign aid to be more effective. And I want to put in there too that how do we keep foreign aid from getting to our enemies? I've had State Department people here before, and they've told me that 100% we cannot guarantee that some of that money is not getting to our enemies.
Yeah, like the vetting question is really serious. I mean, where we actually are vetting both people and organizations that implement our foreign assistance, making sure that they are trusted individuals. We do that on a very limited basis, focused on very specific regions in the world. And we do it almost exclusively focused on terrorism concerns rather than transnational concerns, criminal enterprises. I think if we start expanding both what we are looking for in our vetting and expanding the amount of time and effort we focus on vetting, expand the number of countries, I think we can get a lot better and be closer to protecting the investments the American people are making.
Okay, make sure, have I not gone? Oh, I'm good. You got any recommendations, any of the further recommendations that we could follow up with, maybe in legislation or otherwise, to ensure that would happen?
Yeah, I think that, we have to take this stuff the impact assessment very seriously. You know, we have a logic model whenever we do any type of foreign assistance work that the money that we put into this program will result in this type of outcome. But we rarely actually track as to whether that actually happens. And often when we do track whether it happens, it's not true. The great example is greater economic assistance programs in Central America. The theory was if we put more money into economic assistance programs, that will keep people from migrating to the north. Turns out we made them just a little bit less poor, which allowed them to have better ability to pay for somebody to go to the north. So it had the exact opposite. Great logic, terrible results. That's not the type of programs we should be funding, and I think Congress can really dig in and require that type of impact that is essential.
We run out of time, and I want to thank y'all. Tom, miss seeing you, brother, but it just kind of reminds me, my mama was a school teacher, and the last 10 years of her teaching career, she taught at a historically black college, and they had a saying, they don't want a handout, just a hand up. And I think that's something that we should take to heart because it just seems that we are missing the boat on this thing. And I think long term, we're going to hurt ourselves because people are getting tired of just hearing about the misuse and the people that are abusing, specifically UN, things like that. So thank you all very much.
So we're well into a vote series here. As long as you all can hold on for us, we would fully intend to come back with a few more questions. So we will briefly recess for this vote. We do appreciate your patience, and the committee will stand in recess until subject to the call of the chair. Committee will come to order. I want to thank you all for waiting patiently for us. We tried to hold it off until the end of that last vote and then did the following vote immediately, so hopefully you didn't feel like you had to wait too long. We're going to now go to my colleague from Florida, Mr. Mills, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. I appreciate you guys being here. I appreciate the chairman for putting this together. I wanted to go through a couple of just very easy questions for you. You know, Republicans are putting human rights defenders' lives at risk, is what we're being told. And I just want to talk about what a kind of hyperbolic statement that is when these things are made by our colleagues, but also others. Certain offices at the state, like DRL, use this argument and intentionally overclassify information as a way to shield their program from congressional scrutiny and accountability. Can you tell me whether or not you feel that's true, that we are in some way putting human rights lives at risk?
I think there was a conversation about whether we should be, the State Department should be putting on a website or being much more public about all of the grants that go out to help human rights defenders in
Transparency, right?
dictatorship. And I said if we did, in some cases, if we did that, it would be putting their lives at risk. I wasn't accusing anyone of doing that now because we're not doing that now.
But I mean, Congress is more than capable of being able to understand certain classified sensitivities.
Correct.
But at the same time, in an effort to try, and this is the oversight and accountability piece, we're supposed to show transparency and accountability for the American people and also for the taxpayers and how things are being done. My chairman here has even in the past shown where on a new department or bureau that had been established, it wouldn't even say who works for those independent. Is that not correct, that we tried to source this multiple times? How is that in some way not showing transparency, accountability, or in some ways putting someone at risk of a classification when you don't even show who's actually part of that actual independent department or bureau?
I think we may be talking, you mean a bureau of the U.S. government?
Yes, I mean, I'll
Okay, well, that's a totally different
gentleman would
issue
yield
we have
for a
not,
moment.
we have not
I
discussed
yield.
in this hearing.
It was the climate czar, Mr. Kerry, that would not identify the individuals being paid by the taxpayers who are working in his office.
and so,
Totally different issue from grants
but do you
made
think
to
that
human rights
those
defenders.
do you think those types of things, though, should be held or classified, or do you think they should be transparent to the American people?
I think those things should be transparent to Congress.
I would
There are
absolutely agree.
There are situations where, again, we're talking about human rights defenders in Cuba or Lebanon or Iraq or China. Like, we do have to be careful whether something is formally classified or not. I'm sure you would agree, not to endanger people who share our values, who take the risk of being partners with the U.S. government.
But I think you would also agree that making sure that we find out where these grant fundings are allocated. So let's just say as an example, and I'm sure that it's already been beaten a few times on this, but what about the money that's being allocated to UNRWA? What about the $343 million that went to them last year, where you had members of UNRWA who was participating in the October 7th incident? Or the fact that they've said almost 10% of the 13,000 employees actually celebrated the attack on October 7th. I mean, Mr. Richardson, in your opinion, do you think that an organization who participates in such things should continue to receive government funding?
No, of course not. I think the larger issue is also that we don't require any vetting of U.S. dollars to go into the UN system. So while we know what happened with UNRWA because of reporting, we don't actually do our own independent analysis and security checks of humans that are actually receiving funding, and so we need to change that, especially with the UN
And
system.
this is exactly what the OIG and SOPCO talked about with SIGAR with regards to the independent grants and how they're being weaponized and being abused. You watched where companies like Chemonics International and DAE and Creative Associates and all these supposed implementing partners who continue to say that they're doing things to get advocacy We're actually just telling people, hey, we have to get grants out as fast as possible because if we don't spend the money, we're not going to be able to receive our second tranche. That is not what I consider to be fiscally responsible, and especially if you go back to the November 2011 IG report from SIGAR on the Comonix Afghan Stabilization Initiative program in southern Afghanistan, where money was being allocated and in some cases falling into the hands of Taliban and also those who are running the poppy and opium fields. So my point is in all of this, and I know this is the point of the chairman as well, we need to have better oversight, accountability to make sure that this money is not falling into the hands of the very people that we say that we're trying to combat against. And I think that the only way we're going to do that is to have more transparency from departments like the DRL. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. We're going to go to another round of questioning here. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. And as I start out here, maybe there's some agreement or some good debate between you two. What is the budget that we're looking at, on average, year over year? What are some of the budgets we're looking at for DRL from what you all have seen in terms of grants going out the door?
Well,
Not everything coming in for salaries, but when we're talking about grants going out the door, what are you guys seeing, if we can agree on some kind of roundabout?
yeah, we were looking at at least when I was Assistant Secretary, it was about $1.5 billion. I think it's gone up a bit. The operations budget was about 40 million.
Yeah, that's not right. So the grant budget when I was there was a little over $100 million a year. During the Trump administration, Congress increased it. It went up about 4 times. I don't have the exact figure, obviously, but it went up to, I think, in the $400 to $500 million range.
How many grants do you all think that's getting divided into?
It's about, I think, on an annual basis, roughly about 1,000. DRL is one of the cool things about the Bureau, in my view, is that they're pretty good at doing very small grants. So like USAID can't do anything under like mega millions. One of the best programs that DRL has, that has strong bipartisan support, is the ability to get very tiny grants of like $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 out in even less than 48 hours.
And of the
To people, just let me
1,000
finish,
grants,
to
how many
people who needed
sub-grants
to
do we
like
think
stay
we're talking
alive.
about? How many sub-grants do you all think? The entity that you wrote a grant to is now writing another or several other grants to other entities that you did not actually give $1 to. You did not vet.
That's pretty hard. That's pretty hard to say. That was the basis for my comment about the big organizations like Comonix and others that understand the federal acquisition regulations. You can't, without doing what Jim said earlier, get down into the field and give some Nigerian human rights defenders, a small grant for peace building. I mean, they just don't know how to account for the money. So it requires a lot more. A lot of that money gets sucked off in overhead, I would suggest to you.
Elaborate on that when you say sucked off in overhead. Right, I brought up the example numerous times. We almost had a whole hearing on the atheism in Nepal. But the numbers are round, and so we'll use it as an example. $500,000, expand atheism in Nepal. It was denied here for several hours until we ultimately held it up. And then afterwards, the people that were here denying it for 2 hours called me afterwards and said, oh, crap, sorry, and we missed half of the slides in the program. By the way, here they are. The lawyer sent it to us. But when you look at that $500,000, Nepal's probably daily wages, probably $2 a day on average, something like that there. So what do you think the $500,000 went to? I know this is a pure speculation question, but was it $50,000 towards producing 100 slides to give a PowerPoint, and then the other $450,000 in paying salaries for people at some NGO sitting in England, or what is it?
Well, it is pure speculation. Jim would probably know better what the overhead rates are.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about sort of generically rather than the specific, because I don't know the specific project. The challenge that we have, and you're exactly right. So what we end up doing is we'll give a grant to an NGO in London who will then hire some random German to then fly to Uganda and set up a program where there'll be an office space, there'll be this guy's family or this gal's family, and then they'll run a program which will have slides and office and those types of things. Once you start getting to the actual implementation of the program, what we often see is a 50% overhead rate. And there's been efforts afoot to try to limit the overhead rate, and it's different between contractors and grantees, and what that actually does is different based upon the type of program, the sector, the region that you're operating. But there's a lot of countries that do foreign assistance that really try to limit overhead to under 10%, which I think is the right metrics and right approach.
And would you say what you're outlining is par for the course, whether you're talking about DRL or USAID or commerce or take your pick of where the dollars might be coming from in terms of aid going abroad?
Every agency is different, but I do think that there's general consensus about, that is the way most of at least in the foreign assistance side at state and aid, there is a consistency. As the former congressman said, I mean, you have DRL does sort of micro grants where aid sort of lives in the $1 to $5 million range. So there's a little bit of different in scale, which allows you to have different expectations. And there's also different levels of programming. Often you'll see 5-year programs run out of aid, where you may have shorter out of DRL. So it just depends on each one.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We heard today that DRL does somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 grants, hundreds of millions of dollars, but the majority keeps on coming back to this supposed atheism grant in Nepal. And I just want to make the record really clear here. This is a grant that was done through the International Religious Freedom Grant Program at DRL, and it directly implements an amendment to the Frank Wolf Act that was introduced and supported by a Republican member of this committee who actually supports this program. The programming grant on the state side, it followed proper process, and it supported a mission to support religious freedom broadly. This is about religious freedom broadly in Nepal, but that includes non-belief. So just because one element of this is non-belief doesn't mean that's the focus of the entire program. This is about religious freedom in Nepal broadly. And there was a comment that there's no evidence that atheism is under attack in Nepal, and I would like to submit into the record a report, a country update on Nepal from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom from August of 2023 that specifically talks about the assaults on religious freedom, including non-belief in Nepal, if I may submit this to the record. So I just think it's really important that we baseline and we talk about facts here, right? Because the challenge is, and when we cherry pick individual instances of grants, some of which could be done better, right? We talked about this. There's always room for improvement. There's always things that can be done better. But we use those cherry-picked instances that then broaden out and talk about the grant process overall. That can be very, very dangerous. So, Mr. Malinowski, I'd like to just come back to you about your experience. What can we do better, right? But also, what do we do well?
Yeah, just to reinforce your point, look, the religious freedom programs are wonderful, and that 100% came from the Republican side of the House originally as something that the State Department needed to do. When we're funding an NGO, say, in Iraq that is working with the Christian minority in that country, helping them, empowering them to stand up for their rights, we're not promoting Christianity any more than this grant was promoting any particular religion. It's promoting people's right to stand up for their beliefs. To your point, the broader point, and I think this is really important, Mr. Richardson at one point rightly said that it should be our goal to localize, right? We don't want to be giving all the money to some, group in London that works through a contractor in Germany where most of the money is not actually going to help the people on the ground. The reason why we sometimes do that is because there's oversight. We don't want the money to be misspent. We want to know what's going on. You guys are pushing us for more oversight, or pushing the State Department. And that pushes in the direction of more bureaucracy. of more people in fancy offices in Western countries doing more paperwork to make sure we don't have even a single example of something not going in the right direction. So there's a balance here. We want more of the money to go locally. We want some freedom to experiment, right? I mean, any of us who have led a team in the military, in the State Department, know it's best to empower, to hire good people, empower them to go out, be creative, and not have to ask for permission for everything. But there's got to be some oversight because if you don't have it, there will be mistakes. And so there has to be a balance. And that means, yeah, you got to hold the State Department accountable if you see something you don't like. But understand if they never do anything you don't like, that's probably because there's too much bureaucracy, too much control from the top, and we're not actually getting the really good programming that comes from a little bit of freedom and flexibility. Keep that balance.
And in the remaining time, Mr. Malinowski, what would be the impact in your view of an 11% across the board cut to the state and foreign ops program?
Yeah, well, it's actually not across the board. I think I looked at what the committee did. One of the things they did, for example, was eliminate all funding for the United Nations general budget. I know the UN is a whipping boy around here, but okay, you want to end sanctions enforcement on North Korea and Iran and on ISIS and on Al-Qaeda? That's what would happen if we did that. There are a lot of things the UN does that don't get a lot of attention because we agree with them. We tend to only pay attention to the things we don't like. So massive cuts like that would absolutely undermine the U.S. national security interest, and I sincerely hope we don't go there. The
Thank you. I'm
programs
out of
we're
time
talking about, we should be spending more, not less.
Thank you. I'm out of time and yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. I know this is not the time for us to continue to fully hash out Nepal as an issue. We argued it plenty for several hours here before. But I would say that if the paper, the document that State Department literally puts forward on this grant for Nepal says expanding atheism, I would say expanding is promoting. And I would further make the point that the folks on the ground said that atheism was not one of the marginalized groups. Atheists were not one of the marginalized groups in Nepal. This was absolutely an instance, Mr. Malinowski, I think you used an appropriate word, experimentation. I don't think the American people want their dollars used for experimenting on whether atheism should be expanded in some country abroad. And I appreciate the comments on it. I appreciate the thought on it, but I entirely disagree, regardless of where the policy came from. I believe it is now back to Mr. Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Look, I want to talk about this whole grant and localization thing, but I also want to talk about how these grants has not seen any national security strategic success and goals. Let's go back to Afghanistan and Iraq. I spent 7 years in Iraq, almost 3 years in Afghanistan. I've worked with the State Department, I've worked with the government, I've worked with the agencies, I've worked in uniform, and I've watched the gross abuse of programs like Black and Veatch's Kandahar-Helmand Power Project. The idea of being able to spend billions and billions of dollars that we're going to do hydro turbine electricity into Kandahar-Helmand, and that's somehow going to work. Are you aware with what happened with that project, Mr. Malinowski?
No, and again, what we've been focused on here is we do need to distinguish between big economic development
But
projects.
this didn't start out as a big economic development program. Originally, they were saying that we're going to give small grants to the people that are there to do construction areas just to try and refurbish what was existing. Then that failed. Then it was, okay, now we need to grow this a little bit bigger. Okay, now that failed. Now we need to go ahead and bring in all new equipment. Now that failed. And then it starts to get to the tunes of billions and billions of dollars. And you said something that USA doesn't do small grants. Well, I know for a fact that in Libya, you had organizations like DAI and also Creative Associates and also Chemonics who's given $1,000 to $5,000 grants. They were giving grants. Do you want to know what one of those was for? It was to buy speaker equipment for a local rapper, because they thought that if he made music about governance, that was going to stabilize the nation. Does that seem like that's what American taxpayers want to see? Is there money being spent to buy rap equipment for people in a nation which has nothing to do with stabilization, never had any actual impact whatsoever? These are the things that, my point in bringing up these failed programs is that we've tried the monitoring evaluation. We contract one company. We then contract a company like Management Systems International, MSI, who's supposed to be the M&E gurus and experts, who then spend even more money, and then they can't even track the money that they're spending for M&E while trying to also track the money that's being done to the implementing partner. And then we talk about this grand scheme of we're going to do localization. Let's talk about localization. The only difference is instead of the Thursday night debauchery that goes on by most of the expats that are over there celebrating drinking on a Thursday night like they did in Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the rest, you then just have them refilling boots and positions here in D.C. and calling themselves deputy chiefs of party, program assembly manager, all this. You're not saving any money by trying to do this localization route. And in fact, I would argue that we saw actually a lot more corruption in Iraq as a result of that whenever we were building bridges that were $750 million. And then all of a sudden come to find out half the bridges when we investigated hadn't even been built. My issue is that I don't see where cash diplomacy has been successful. I don't see where that's stabilized nations. Where's Iraq right now? Where's Afghanistan right now? Where's Libya right now? We spent trillions of dollars in these nations, and then we throw it out when we do things like the 2005 Iraq Constitution under Article 76 that establishes sectarianism, which hasn't existed since pre-apartheid eras in North Ireland. My point is that we can talk about M&E and all this. I disagree with your assertion that, the UN enforces all these grand sanctions. What about the sanctions on Iran right now? How's that working with regards to ensuring that they don't export more oil than they've ever done in their history under this administration? Do you think they're imposing sanctions? Do you think they're actually upholding things? No. General Gutierrez and Ban Ki-moon under Resolution 2231 knew there was mid-range ballistic missile, violations, and yet they did nothing to actually prevent it. So tell me again how cash diplomacy makes national security a priority.
Well, we heard about Iran sanctions, people getting drunk, and projects in Afghanistan. There's a lot to respond to.
Do you dispute any of those, though? I've seen it for
I
myself
don't even
firsthand.
know how to make sense of what you just said, but you asked me. Let me take.
Making sense of it is simply this: that
let
the
me
cash
take a
diplomacy
piece of
doesn't
it.
work,
You asked
Malinowski. That's what I'm saying.
You asked about how does helping a rapper who might be spreading a message about democracy help us? Well, I recall that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we helped defeat the Soviet Union in part by supporting artists and writers and cultural people and radio programmers and musicians and people who were spreading the culture of democracy through art in Europe. You talk to any dissident in Eastern Europe who went through that, and they would say that's one of the most effective things that we did.
Where's Libya now? Are they a failed state?
What's that?
Would you consider Libya a failed state?
I'm talking about Eastern Europe.
But I didn't mention Eastern Europe. I mentioned that specific program just to show that this is not being effective. And I asked how national security is improved.
Much of the things we try to do are not going to be successful. When I was at DRL, I used to make an analogy, a baseball analogy to my team. I said that if you're batting 300 in a world where you're going up against dictators, sociopaths, mass murderers.
Well, at 35.6 trillion in debt, I don't think that we can be batting a 300 for the American people.
Well, it's better than batting zero.
Well, I can tell you right now, we are
stop
batting
trying,
zero.
Who's going to cheer it? It's going to be the Russian government, the Chinese Communist Party would love us to stop doing this. If you think it's unsuccessful,
but they're already expanding, sir. You're seeing the Russia, China, Iran, North Korea geopolitical alignment already
all
expanding.
Of our enemies
You've watched
passing
Belt and Road
laws?
Initiative expand. You've watched China continuing to go into developing nations all across Africa and being
fighting.
very successful in this.
They're
You're
fighting.
watching Wagner Group down in Chad and CAR, who's continued to expand, and now they're in our own Western Hemisphere with economic coercion of Honduras and Panama taking over the canals for treaties, going into Cuba, and actually helping with the fentanyl pill presses of Darien Gap. So we're not winning the war against China, Russia, by going out and doing what you're saying, which is these small funding grants.
So why are they passing laws and all of their allies to try to forbid us from doing these grants?
Why are we continuing to go ahead and give money but not account for where it's going?
It's your
Why
job
are we
to
still
account for
giving
where
money into the Taliban by paying certain electric bills and housing rental bills that we know falls into the hands of those very people we fought for 20 plus years? I mean, my point is that I don't believe and what you're doing is successful. I don't believe in the USAID cash diplomacy model, and I've seen it fail time and time again firsthand as I sat on these things like Ramp Up North. And you can continue to do your little eyebrow roll or whatever you'd like to do right now. But you know for a fact that if we go and look at the monitoring evaluation books, we look at cigar reports, we look at OIG off of John Sopko, that you can't dispute the fact that a lot of money was waste, fraud, and abuse at the taxpayers' expenses.
Well, maybe I'll put you down as a maybe, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I have one final round of questions. I don't know if my colleague has another one, but it's a little bit more open-ended for you all. Let's just simply say, any advices, any ideas that you all have to increase transparency for these grants within the State Department across the board? Does not have to be DRL, where you two spent your time. Could be in USAID, could be anywhere. Would love to hear those. I think it's one of the most important things that we can hear from all of you.
The one thing that hasn't really been, you mentioned it briefly in your opening statement, but it's branding. We fail to really brand the gift from the American people that we are doing great and amazing work all around the world. We don't take credit for it. It's often at a little emblem in the bottom of Chemonics roadway sign, thinking that Chemonics is the one who delivered that project that impacted the lives of those people. No, it was the hard work of the American people paying their taxes, and that resulted in that. And if we're not proud about it, then we shouldn't have done it. And so I think we should definitely pass a strong branding bill and put the American flag on foreign assistance projects.
Agreed. Please, by all means, Mr. Destro. Mr.
Well,
Malinowski.
thank you. I think that there is a danger for being too narrow in our focus, whether or not it's on a local program like Libya, which is a completely failed state, where we actually, as a human rights matter, have actual slave markets. But on the other hand, you have this focus on the atheism grant. What I'd like to suggest is that we need to pull the aperture back a bit and look at both our domestic and our foreign policy. We say that we're for religious freedom, but we're for deconstructing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian government is arresting priests and nuns. It's funding the Greek Orthodox newspapers while standing silent while the the Organization of Ukrainian Journalists, Orthodox journalists, nothing's said about them. And so what we need to be doing, and I'll just give you another example. I spent a lot of time on Xinjiang and on the surveillance state in China. I went through the Cleveland airport not long ago and was, given the opportunity to have my face scanned. So this question of what are human rights and what are we doing both inside and outside the country, it's not an accident that many countries think we're hypocrites. Because we say one thing and then we do things with our money that we shouldn't be very proud of.
Mr. Malinowski, any suggestions that you might have for transparency within grants? We'd love to hear them.
So don't get me wrong, I am for transparency. And, I was slightly critical of a proposal Mr. Destro made to put everything on a website. I'm actually for putting almost everything on a website. I think it should be easier for...
Can we pause there one second? Was it a website or was it an internal server, an internal list?
Right now, I'd be satisfied with the internal server. I mean, that I think because two ambassadors have told me that they cannot get the information.
That you created. Was it a public domain website or was it?
Right, and it's based on what they call the Secretary's dashboard. Okay. Pulls the money, it pulls the information real time out of the F database.
So, look, I think, just as an American citizen, like it would be, I would love there to be a website where you can go and see in a more clear, user-friendly way what we're doing in various countries. If it were very clear, it would also point out in many cases that the money spent is not being sent to that country. We had that debate over Ukraine aid. A lot of it is spent in the United States. Some of it is donated as grants to organizations in that country. That kind of transparency I'm for, with the important caveat that applies particularly to DRL programs, less so to AID programs, that when you're working in a dictatorship and there are people who are risking their lives to do the work, anti-corruption, anti-torture, pro-human rights, then it's just common sense, good judgment that we're not going to splash over all over a website, Mr. Dictator, here's who you should arrest because they're working with the United States. I hope we would all agree with that. But beyond that, yeah, I think the more you guys can push for that, the better for everybody concerned. I'm personally proud of most of what the State Department is doing. I'd be happy to see it more transparently presented in that way.
Mr. Crow?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Malinowski, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to take some time here to respond to some of the back and forth and the issues raised by my colleagues. I know you didn't fully have the opportunity to respond to that, so I'll give you my time.
Well, thank you. Look, I started out where Mr. Mass started out by mentioning the Tiananmen Square anniversary because I think we should be focused on big stuff here, on what's important. And in a sense, I think we all agree there is a contest in the world right now between the democracies led by the United States and dictatorships led particularly by China, and we have to be spending money in a variety of ways all over the world if we want to win that contest. And I'm very concerned when I hear that because of some members of Congress being concerned about a particular grant, which is fine, that's normal, that's your job, even if we may disagree about the merits of that particular grant, that you have a situation where right now, I'm told about 60% of the grant funding that DRL has is held by members of this committee. If you disagree with $20,000 that might have indirectly contributed to a canceled drag show in Ecuador, whatever, we can argue that. It should not be an argument for holding 60% of money that is absolutely critical to people who I think all of us would agree are fighting for good things like religious freedom and human rights in countries around the world, who are in effect defending the gospel of liberty, freedom, and human rights that is associated with America in opposition to what China and Russia are spreading in the world. And so absolutely conduct oversight, but do it in a serious and responsible way that protects and enhances the important things that the State Department is doing in response to congressional pressure in most cases to stand up for our values and our interests. That would be my plea to you today. This has been bipartisan for as long as I have been working on these issues for over 20 years. That needs to remain.
Thank you, and I just also wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of times the issue of money provided to folks under assault in Afghanistan falling into the hands of the Taliban. And we support people fighting for freedom and democracy and their rights that are under oppressive regimes pretty regularly, right? You had mentioned North Korea, you had mentioned Iran, you had mentioned Cuba, of course, Afghanistan is another example. Can you just briefly discuss what controls and checks are in place when we do that to make sure that that money is not misappropriated or fall into the wrong hands?
So again, really important to distinguish between the types of things that SIGAR would evaluate. These are largely big infrastructure and development projects where you've got a lot of local business contractors. And the funding that I'm most familiar with, which is in Afghanistan going to go to maybe support some journalists who are still trying to do actual journalism against the Taliban in the country, or a small grant that might help a women's rights group have an office or pay for a court case or do the things that they need to do to stay alive. We have safeguards for all of these projects, even for the very small ones. There's project evaluation, reviews, external evaluation that goes into a lot of these projects. But for the most part, I'm not so worried about a little women's rights NGO in Afghanistan. That grant is not going to end up in the hands of the Taliban. That is 100% in our interest. It's the right thing to do. And the Taliban hopes and prays we stop doing it. So keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Mills.
We talked about human rights, and I want to key off something. Do you think what's happening in our southern border with regards to the amount of human and child trafficking is a human rights tragedy?
Human trafficking is a horrible human rights tragedy, yes.
Do you think that the open borders are leading to an increase in human rights violations?
I do not believe we have open borders on the southern border.
You don't believe that the 9.8 million people who's crossed our borders illegally, that is an increase in what we've seen in previous administrations?
I don't think we're going to have the time to debate our border policy here, Mr. Mills, but no, I do not
Malinowski,
believe.
we will actually be able to debate whatever the chairman actually allocates the time on, correct?
Okay, that's fine.
You've sat in Congress, you know how this works.
I do.
So my point is that if we're worried about the human rights violations, and it is atrocious what's happening, we know what the cartels and what others are doing with regards to almost 40+% of the revenue they took in. You know, it was $500 million in cartel revenue in 2018. Fast forward to 2022, we're over $13 billion in cartel revenue.
Yeah, they're gaming our asylum
And
policy.
we're seeing where there's millions upon millions of people crossing our borders, of which many are being used and thrown into child and sex trafficking and sex slavery, things like this, which is a pretty atrocious thing I think we all could agree on. Wouldn't our money be better allocated focusing on human rights violations and things like that that directly impacts our country more so than throwing money to other nations where we're not going to make, I mean, it's a drop in the bucket, it's not going to make an impact?
So number one, that's why I wish and still hope that you guys pass a bipartisan bill that is
You mean
the
HR
toughest.
2 Secure the Border Act, which actually was passed over a year ago, sitting in the Senate in the Democrat control?
The bill that a bipartisan coalition in the United States Senate agreed to that was
Well,
not
it didn't even
passed
pass the
because
Senate.
the nominee of your party for president said it won't help
Well,
me
but wait a
gain
second.
re-election.
Well, let's talk about border policy now that you brought that up, though. Doesn't the president have executive order with unilateral authority under 212 Section F to immediately secure the border?
My understanding is he's going to be issuing that executive order.
Why did he
this
wait
week.
until right around the election period time as opposed to closing it before 11 million people come across the border?
I can't speak for him, but I
Or
I
70
think
to
he
100,000 who
probably
dies
would
from
have
fentanyl
preferred-
overdose? Or the criminals who have actually killed people like Lake and Riley? Or even my own state legislator, Keon Michaels, whose son was killed by an illegal who crossed illegally 3 times back into the
My
country.
guess is that he hoped Congress would do its job, and when Congress explicitly said, we will not do our job because
So there's
Donald
no
Trump is
federal-
ordering us
wait.
not to, then now the
Well, wait,
president
Mr.
is going to
Malinowski,
take...
isn't there federal laws already in place to ensure the security of our borders?
There are quite a few federal laws, but they need to be funded.
Well, and they are funded. But HR 2, which actually passed the House, because like you just pointed out, the Senate has supposedly a bipartisan bill, which is an amnesty bill, that wouldn't even pass its own chamber. But ours actually passed over a year ago, which could make tangible results and impact. And yet the Senate hadn't taken that up. Now, that's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's an American issue.
Yeah,
That
which
we
is
need to
why
secure our borders
Republicans
and we need to take care of
Democrats
things.
need to work together, as they did, to produce something that both sides can support with compromises on both sides. A lot of Democrats embraced that mostly Republican bill in the Senate because they understood they had to make compromises. And the Republican sponsor of that bill, one of the most conservative Republicans in the United States
Well, I would
Senate,
disagree with that.
said the only reason we are not doing this is because our nominee from president said it would hurt him politically to secure the border before the election.
And then he
And as
also
a
came
result-
back and actually said that his bill, and this was said by both Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, that the bill wouldn't actually secure our borders and that more would actually be needed. My point is that we talk
It's
about
always
human
needed, so let's
rights. We
start
talk
somewhere.
about all the things that are significant and important. We talk about, but the American people is the most important, and that's who we're fighting for. That's who we take the taxpayers' money to provide and protect for.
A
And
great
our own
country
borders
can
and the human rights
secure-
violations on, I was just in South Texas for 3 days ago, right there in Mission, Texas, and going down the borders and watching where I can tell you it was not secured. It was not.
A
It
great
was
country
very much an
can
open
secure
border.
its border and lead in the world. I'm looking at these paintings looking down on us right now. And the people who have sat in that chair, Republicans and Democrats, who have believed what every Democratic and Republican president of my lifetime has believed, the United States can take care of its own people, and we can lead in the
But we
world.
can't at 35.6 trillion, where next year we will pay more in interest payments than we'll pay in national defense, first time in history. Only 28 nations in the world's history has ever paid 130% GDP, and only one survived, which is Japan. America is becoming the next fiscal experiment, and I don't think at $35.6 trillion, with our GDP to national debt ratio being where it's at, with the attack on fossil fuels, with the open borders, with the continuation of funding these kinetic wars that we don't need to be involved in. And sir, I've fought enough kinetic wars to not want to be involved in more, or to put another man or woman on the battlefield in an area that has nothing to do for a neocon, neo-lib interventionist mindset. I'm not an isolationist, but I'm a protectionist.
Well, then
And so
fund
I
the
think that
State
utilizing money in the right way
Gentleman's time
and human
has
rights on the border
expired.
matters.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Crow for a closing statement.
Thank you, Chairman, for calling this important hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses today for having a robust discussion and talking about some areas for improvement and oversight. There is no organization in the world, whether you're talking about a business, a family, a government agency, or a department, that can't find ways of improving. That's why this committee is so important, and I look forward to working with all of you and the chairman and finding ways that we can promote transparency, that we can maybe look at options for putting appropriate grants that would not jeopardize people's lives on internal or external portals to improve those processes. There's certainly ways of doing that, certainly ways of improving it. But I come back to what I was talking about earlier, this idea of taking specific incidents of things that didn't go as they were supposed to go, and then using those to attack the entire system, and to say that grants writ large are not working and effective is just a non sequitur. These programs are extremely valuable for our nation. I will push back on this idea that we don't have the ability to take care of ourselves at home and the world at the same time. If we are going to be a great power, and if we're going to be a leader in the world, we have to do both. And we have to do both not just because it's charity and not because we just want to, because it's in our self-interest to do both. If history has ever shown or taught us anything, it's that when we pull inward and we neglect the world and we don't pay attention to conflict and oppression in other places, it eventually finds us and it comes to our door. Over and over again, that is the lesson of history. So these investments are to prevent those problems from coming to our door and threatening the American people. It's in our national security interest, it's in our economic self-interest, and these are investments that are targeted, that have great return on investment in many cases. Not all of them. We'll always work on improving. We'll work on figuring out areas where we can course correct when necessary. But to cut these programs and attack these programs writ large is the wrong answer, and it doesn't serve our interests, and it doesn't serve the interests of the American people. So with that, I thank all the witnesses, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. Recognize myself for a closing statement. I thank you all for your testimony, for your service to America. I don't like personally when it's ever flippantly said any organization has room for improvement. Any organization can find a few places where dollars were wasted and they can root that out, and we should fix that. There's a very specific and important difference between the United States government and any organization. The United States government gets every single dollar from we the people. People go out to work. They work all night, they work one job, they work 3 jobs. The government takes their money and then doesn't just build a road so that they can get to and from work or to and from school with their kids or whatever. They send it to countries thousands of miles away at what everybody has agreed upon, which is a larger extent than every other country combined. This is not a situation where we could say, yes, every organization has room for improvement and we just need to do it a little bit better. There is tremendous room for this to be that's an understatement, to be done better. There is absolutely waste and abuse, and there's absolutely policy that's being made by the personnel that are out there authoring grants, soliciting grants, that is not connected to broader goals that every agency is working in tandem to achieve. And that doesn't work for the American people. We did speak briefly about the idea of earmarks and comparing earmarks to transportation earmarks here domestically. I wish, personally, if I could make the policy law that every grant that goes abroad, every solicitation for a grant that goes abroad, be treated like a domestic earmark where some member of Congress had to come in here and request that specifically, that $500,000 for Nepal or that $20,000 for drag shows in Ecuador or the thousands of other things that exist within USAID or other places. I wish that members had to come in here, make the case, speak to the diplomats that are going to be executing those things on the ground, and come in here and make the case to the appropriators. They want that earmark. I wish that that was the case. I think there would be a lot less requests for these grants, and I think there would be a much higher level of accountability. I wish, and I will continue to work for policy, that these grants not be automatically reauthorized from not just being executed in 1 year, but being executed 2 years, 3 years, 5 years in a row without them being looked at again. I don't think that that is responsible to the American people, especially when, again, I believe many of these grants and these solicitations for grants are avowedly left-wing and radical policies that are being funded through the taxpayers, through the State Department, by writing a grant, and then that agency is writing a sub-grant or a sub-grant to that, which nobody ever gets eyes on. Certainly not the U.S. taxpayer. That being said, thank you for the comments about where you see room for improvement, where you see the ability to improve this process. I will continue to work in some of the ways that you all brought up and some of the ways that I just brought up. And in that, pursuant to committee rules, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. And without objection, this committee stands adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Crow.